Hey, good morning, everybody. This is People of Substance by LemonSkies. I'm your host, Olga Waltman, and my guest today is Melissa Moré. And Melissa and I met each other working together. We're colleagues, but we're actually talking today because of our shared engagement in volunteerism, and that's really been the nexus for what we bonded around. So, Melissa, please say hello and introduce yourself.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for involving me today. My name's Melissa Moré, and like Olga shared, I think we've really found some common space through volunteerism and just civic engagement and books and all kinds of other fun things. So thanks for having me this morning.
So, Melissa, thrilled to have you here. In professional capacity, you work with volunteers, engaging them, teaching them about mission, etc. But I want to actually ask you first, how did you make your way into nonprofit sector? What led you down this path, and why specifically volunteerism?
Yeah. So I feel like I was born to do this work. I know it seems strange, but I can't really recall a time in my life that I haven't been involved in some sort of volunteer work. It really was part of my upbringing. My grandmother was someone who was very active in the community. She was a military veteran. She had served during Korean War, World War II. And she did a lot of volunteer work with our local VA hospital. And so that was really kind of my first introduction of volunteering, is, going along with her, helping her with different things that she was working on. I was a Girl Scout in kindergarten, started in kindergarten, was a Girl Scout for 10 years. And so that was another way that it's always been part of who I am. I just really appreciate that my family really emphasized the importance of each of us doing whatever we could to help our community. And that's just, something that has really carried me throughout my, schooling and then into my profession. And so, I was just kind of thinking back on that. And, the part where I think that I sort of made the connection of that there was a path in a professional world was back in my undergraduate. I was part of an organization called Volunteer UCF, and it was through the University of Central Florida. And so I was on the board for that student organization, and I was leading a student organization called Get Carded. And the idea behind Get Carded was to get students educated around organ and tissue donation and the importance of that. So that was Get Carded was the phrase that we use for college students. And so that was really my first kind of foray into recognizing the ability to really engage a community of people into supporting a mission and supporting a whole educational awareness campaign. And so that's sort of where I recognize that's actually what led me into pursuing my master's degree in public health. And so I just really saw like the importance of engaging our community, educating our community, and empowering volunteers to be part of that mission. So that, when I think back of like, where did I kind of foray into like seeing that this could actually be a profession? I think that was really where it sort of became, I don't know, it sort of became a vision that I could actually do this work as a professional.
I appreciate how you're describing volunteers, and it's empowering as opposed to kind of very patronizing. Sometimes volunteers are sort of like, let's just throw something at them. It's like, what a nuisance. But you're really talking about it in a very different way about engaging them and bringing them in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was snooping around, and you volunteer. I know you volunteered for Junior League for a long time. I know scouting, Girl Scouts in particular, is close to you personally, and I know your daughter is a scout. You volunteer also with hospice and palliative care, which seems like a very heavy subject matter. So I guess, how do you choose where you get involved, where you spend your time? I sort of think about this a lot. There's so many causes and issues that are compelling to me, and I'm trying to be very deliberate in kind of what I lean into, not because I don't care about other issues, but just sort of you have to pick one or two or a couple at most, and kind of stick with that. So how did you land?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I think where the idea of volunteering with Junior League of Clearwater Dunedin, which is the local chapter that I volunteer with, really started when I moved to the community I live in now about 12 years ago. And I initially thought of it as a way to get to know people. I was new to the community, although I'd grown up not too far away from where I live now, but I didn't really know how to connect with other people, without being in college or having that kind of connection. So I saw it as an opportunity to get to know other like-minded women because it is an all women's organization. And so I was introduced by someone that I worked with at the time, and she was like, come out to one of our events and learn about it. So that's really what initially drew me in, was this idea of being connected to like-minded people, getting to know my community, getting to know other people in my community. But what has really kept me in the organization is that it's an opportunity to connect with a lot of different organizations in the community. So like you, it's so hard for me to narrow down what I do. I believe in so much of the great work that's happening in local nonprofits. There's so much great things happening. So it's really hard to select just one. But what I found through volunteering with Junior League is that we get exposure to lots of different organizations, and we're able to help support them, whether it's providing community grants or some of us, serving on other committees or councils throughout with other nonprofits, and then volunteering our time. So we go out and support other nonprofits. So it gives me a chance to kind of dabble. Which I would say is also the same for Girl Scouts. So when I had my daughter, I knew as a longtime Girl Scout, my daughter's actually a 4th generation Girl Scout. So it was really important to me that she have that opportunity to at least give it a try. And of course I was like, please, please, please love it, because I had such a great experience. And so once she did, similarly, I found that Girl Scouts is a great way, again, to introduce the girls and myself to other nonprofits, because we get to do, food drives for local food pantries. We help support veterans organizations. We, get to touch on a lot of different organizations. So I think that's helps a bit, so that I feel like I'm getting a little bit of exposure to other things and not kind of cornered into one thing. So yeah.
That's really interesting. So let me ask you this, and I strongly believe that if you work in nonprofit sector, but you're not in any way connected to nonprofits in your own life, it's sort of like, what are you doing, right? Like there is a little bit of that element. I'm not trying to be judgmental, but
no, I feel you. Yeah, I agree.
Like, you don't just care about causes like 9 to 5, and then you clock out and you no longer care, right?
Right.
But with you in particular, how being a volunteer and what you learn on being the volunteering side translates to your professional work in working with volunteers?
Oh my goodness, so much. I often tell people that I feel as though being a volunteer is the best training ground for being a volunteer engagement leader, because I can appreciate a number of things. And one of them is that I've really come to recognize, and I kind of talked about this, like what initially brings someone to your mission and to volunteer with your organization is oftentimes different than what keeps people there. I think a lot of times it's initially the perception of or the connection to the mission. So initially they're like, oh, I really support this mission. But I do believe that in order to keep people excited and to keep people engaged and to feel like they still have a meaningful way to contribute, that it's not just enough. They may still very much support the mission. I don't think that goes away, but what keeps them excited and keeps them at the table, I think, is for a lot of people, finding different ways that they can help. And so, a lot of times we put people into a box and we're like, okay, Melissa does this is her passion work. And we forget that maybe Melissa really wants to try something new. And that's difficult. A lot of times we're like, okay, we found them a role and good, we can check that box off. But I think as volunteer engagement leaders, we have to make sure that we're checking in with people to make sure that it's still the passion that, that they're still getting to use their time in a way that feels best for them. And so, that's like my experience of volunteering with Junior League has been that, what initially brought me into the league was one thing, but what keeps me there is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. And your interests evolve as you change and grow. So, you may have more time or less time that you want to invest in. So sometimes you want that connection, but may not be able to spend quite as much time.
Right. Yeah, that's another great point.
So another question that you and I have touched on before in our conversations, how does volunteer support, volunteer base, how does it connect to philanthropy? Do you think people are volunteers or givers or both, or is it a continuum? Where do you see that fit in?
Yeah, so I really believe that they're much of one of the same. How we collaborate with donors and how we collaborate with volunteers at times may look different, but I really believe at the core it is very similar. It's all, to me, it's simply, well, maybe not simply, but it comes down to relationships. It's that relationship that you're fostering with a person who is in some way connected to your mission. And I find that oftentimes people who give, who donate, and who are, supporters from a financial standpoint are oftentimes volunteers. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that that there is that deep connection, and that in order for people to really, again, it's like, how do we find ways to, to grow that relationship? Mm-hmm. Because a person may initially come to us as a donor, but then you recognize that there's an opportunity that they may really want to help support the work that we're doing and volunteer their time. And then there may be volunteers that, don't recognize or don't think that they have enough, financially to give, and may not realize the ways that they can contribute. So mm-hmm. I really do think those things go hand in hand. And for me, I believe it's all about the relationship building. It's really getting to know what inspires, what motivates. At the core of it, it's that, what makes that person tick, and how do they want to be involved.
I love that. It's all about relationships. So some of the recent numbers, and to your point about it's a single continuum, right? Giving, contributing, volunteering, being involved. I mean, it's sort of all behaviors indicative of our commitment to causes. But recently, well, over decades, really not recently, the number of volunteers has been declining. And, civic engagement is declining, and we're seeing some of the fundraising, philanthropic numbers dipping. One number that I found, and I wrote it down, and maybe pandemic played a role as well, but the recent metric I saw, from 23% of people volunteering in 2019, mm-hmm. it declined by about 7%, which is quite mm-hmm. a drop.
Yeah.
So why do you think people are volunteering less? Do they care less? Do they have less time?
Yeah. So, I've thought about this a lot, because working through volunteer engagement throughout COVID, I definitely felt the impact of volunteer engagement, both as a volunteer mm-hmm. And how I can contribute my time, as well as how my work in leading volunteers. And, I think it is a number of factors. We did experience, figures that I saw were like 30% decrease of volunteer engagement during COVID. And I think that we're starting to build back up. I feel like there is a little bit of a growing momentum as, events are returning in different ways that people traditionally have volunteered are returning. So I think we're starting to see an increase. I hope it seems to be trending. I think the economy, I think that has impacted a lot of people who maybe were able to stay home or work part-time, or have different situations, or, we're hearing people who were retired and are now, either dabbling in maybe part-time work or consulting work, or things that, take away from their ability to volunteer. And I think that is a factor. And I think that also just the way our like corporate world and our business world is changing. So I know I've worked a lot. I've had the pleasure of working a lot with corporate volunteers and working with people, maybe not necessarily like groups of volunteers, although yes, from businesses, but also people who are individually encouraged to volunteer through their organization. So they get like volunteer time off, or they are encouraged to volunteer as a group. And I think now that so many businesses are starting to, or already are working remotely, it sort of takes away from those opportunities for people to come together and volunteer. There's less kind of brick and mortar employment. And so people aren't like signing up to come out and volunteer like they may have in the past. So that's, just, it's one example, but I do think it's a part that, maybe if you're volunteering through your work, then you recognize, oh, maybe I can volunteer on my own as well. So I think that it is a contributor. And then I think that there's just so much information overload. I think for all of us that are in any sort of marketing or, marketing services or recruiting people to volunteer, I think it's just so hard to get through the noise. And a lot of it is there's difficult things happening in our world. But there's also just a lot of, people they're on overload. I mean, I check my emails all day at work, and then I get home and I'm like, oh, do I really want to, be on my phone or be on my computer? And so I think sometimes people are just at overload, and just the idea of like, how to even go about that. So how do we, as volunteer engagement leaders, how do we break through that? And I think that that's the, the ongoing challenge that we face. And I just kind of experienced this recently with an event. We were working with recruiting some volunteers for one of our events. And, there are people that were just like seemingly super excited to volunteer. We had been emailing, and then I was feeling a little bit ghosted as the event was getting closer. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like half of my people aren't responding. And it was a little bit of like, what am I going to do? And so then I was like, I just started texting all of them and just, hey, how's it going? Just checking in. And I, it seems so simple, but I've just really, with this most recent experience, I'm like, okay, people aren't responding to email. And maybe I should have realized that sooner, but I think it's just like, how do we get to the person? Because I realize that, like myself, I have a lot of things coming at me. And so, just giving people grace and realizing that, they're not necessarily ghosting me. They just probably have 20 other things that they're thinking about. And so then, just one caveat of that is, as you said, with donors as well, is like, so if those two things are interconnected, then as we're seeing maybe donations or donors decreasing, then that could also be impacting volunteers, and less volunteers could be impacting the way people give. So I think, again, those two things, I think are going hand in hand.
What you said about corporate, no longer being in person, and people are not as engaged through their companies or their employment because they're teleworking and working remotely. That's such a great point. I sort of think a lot about also, there seems to be less pressure or less sense of obligation to volunteer. To your point about everyone is busy, but in the years past, it almost felt like, well, do you belong to this club? Are you part of the Rotary, or whatever that may be, that community involvement? And it's gotten less so. And I wish we'd go back to that positive societal pressure.
Yeah, I know, me as well. And, I think that's I think it's making it so that that it's as easy to volunteer as possible. I just kind of go back to that because, I think gone are the days where you have volunteers who are like, I can volunteer 20 hours a week. I think, and we've grown, even though that's not been our culture for most people are working when they're of working age. There's very few people, at least that I know, that are able to, stay at home and not work. And so the way in which people can volunteer, I think has been where it has been for a while, but I think we as volunteer engagement leaders have not been willing to do the extra work that it takes to engage people who are busy.
Yeah.
I think that we kind of rely on the fact that there have been those people who can give lots of time, and so we've created volunteer programs that it's if someone doesn't have a lot of time to give, then we don't always roll up our sleeves to do the extra work for the person who might come out for a couple hours to an event. It takes extra work, and that's the reality of it. And so I'm just finding that I have to, accept that I'm going to have to work twice as hard maybe to get half the volunteers. And that's just the reality that I think we have to be prepared for is we can't just expect the floodgates to open and people just to pile in. We have to do the extra work to get people involved.
The same standbys that show up time after time.
Right.
So let's shift gears a little bit. So you and I really bonded over our love of books. And you and I have had multiple conversations about books. And I think there's a Venn diagram of books we've read and books I've read. So I want to ask you about that. How do you find time to read? And what are some of your favorites that you just can't stop thinking about that you've recently read?
Oh, that's great. So it was actually one of the great things that happened during COVID is I discovered a love for audiobooks. Previous to that, I've always been a reader, but I'll say that, especially having like young kids, I had not made it a priority. And during COVID, I discovered the Libby app through the library, and I just started listening to a lot of books. And I realized that when I was listening, like you can fit in reading a lot easier into your life. I always try to tell people, I know it might be hard to concentrate, but you realize when you're driving or when you're cleaning or cooking or whatever, I've just found that I can fit it into my life a lot easier than sitting down reading a book, although I love doing that too. So, for me, I think it's one of those things that once you really get into reading and then you start talking to other people who love reading, then you're like, oh, have you read this book? Have you read that book? And so I have like this endless list of books that I want to read. So it just becomes sort of a, an addiction. It's like, oh, I know what I'm reading next. But I feel like I've had some really great books, but this year I am a total fan of Andy Weir. I'm not sure if it's Andy Weir or Andy Weir, but he wrote the books The Martian and Project Hail Mary. And right now I'm just finishing his other book, Artemis. And I didn't think I would be like a science fiction type of fan. It's not usually my genre, but I am like so into it. I am just hooked. And I tell everyone about it. I have not been able to put his books down.
I'll have to look those up because I looked at, and I'm a big Libby devotee, and like you, I really got into it during the pandemic. But I realized that as I look at my books I've listened to this past year, the most common word in the title has been murder. So I don't know what that says about me, but I feel like I need to maybe mix things up a little bit. It's actually kind of a little bit disturbing how often it shows up. So I'll have to shift it. So let's wrap things up. Have you ever played Two Truth and a Lie?
I have.
But not like the college version. Like this is not, So it's a fun way to just kind of wrap up the conversation. And okay. You and I have known each other professionally, but there's probably a lot of things I don't know about you. So if you share 3 things, 2 of them are truthful and one is a fib, I'll try to guess.
I always have a hard time with these because I always feel like people are super creative with theirs, but I will do my best. So I would say my favorite college course was Death and Dying. I volunteer fostering dogs. And I love roller coasters, but climbing off of heights scares me.
I'm going to go with the last one being a fib, and I'll tell you why. The first 2 seem to be very on brand for you. like fostering animals, and I know you volunteer with the hospice organization. So I feel like those two are very truthful sounding. The roller coaster thing, every year I enjoy them less and less. So I'm going to say that that one is a fib.
So actually the fostering dogs is a fib because as much as I never like to say my husband won't let me, but this is totally one where he's like, you cannot do that because I would keep every single dog. So I am not allowed to foster dogs for my own good because I would keep all of them. So yeah, but I do love roller coasters. And but if you asked me to like climb down a tree, I would be petrified. But I have like jumped off cliffs and I've done roller coasters, and heights don't scare me, but it's just something about like climbing down things that I don't like. So
I can see that. I can see that. So let's hope you never get stuck in a roller coaster.
I know. I have that fear.
Melissa, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you being here, and just really appreciate our working relationship and our friendship. So thank you for being my guest today.
It was fun. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, let's keep on sharing our books.
See you soon.
All right. Bye.